Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Russia revolted after decision to withdraw Russian troops from Kherson. Reactions to Russian leader Putin are growing like avalanche. After humiliating Kherson, Putin was in danger of being overthrown by the Kremlin elite. As the Russian army started to leave Kherson, the reactions from Russia came one after another. Officials in Kremlin accused the Russia state of bowing its head before the whole world with the decision taken by the Russian government in Kherson. The Russian army recently took some measures against a possible Ukrainian attack. The Russian army first started the evacuation process by moving the residents of Kherson to a safe area. Thousands of residents living in Kherson left the Kherson, leaving their homes, the work of memories. However, a significant number of Kherson residents who wanted to live in Kherson and did not participate in eviction process continued to live in their homes. Immediately after issue reached the ears of Russian leader Putin, Putin addressed the residents of region in Kherson during a speech and warned that the possible bombardment threat of the Ukrainian army still continues in the region and that they should be involved in the evacuation process urgently in order to not be affected by the attacks of the Ukrainian army. The Russian army continues the process of evacuation of residents to safe areas in Kherson. Statements came from the head of the Russian army, admitting that things went wrong in Kherson. Russian General Surovikin announced that Russian troops would withdraw from Kherson. Immediately after the Russian general's statement, Russian soldiers began preparation to leave the region. The Ukrainian army continued its advance on Kherson as the Russian troops retreated. The Ukrainian warriors who were advancing to the region step by step encouraged a great surprise after they entered Kherson. Although the Russian army has only just begun to withdraw from Kherson, it made a big mistake and left weapons and military equipment in the region and gave it to the Ukrainian soldiers. The withdrawal of Russian army from the strategically important Kherson in the south of Ukraine caused an earthquake in the Kremlin. The news of the withdrawal in the Kremlin, where the cracks were not resolved, created a shock effect. It is boiling like a witch's cauldron for your Kremlin. Putin is in danger of being overthrown by the Kremlin elite after humiliating the withdrawal of Russian troops in Kherson. Security experts and foreign officials argue that the Kremlin's overthrow of Putin is only a matter of time after months of setbacks in Ukraine. A foreign correspondent claimed that Russia's withdrawal from the strategic city of Kherson posed a danger to Vladimir Putin because it changed the perception of him as a winner and a great strategist among the Russian elite. The Moscow correspondent claimed that Russia's ruling elite around Putin no longer sees him as a formidable leader amid months of setbacks in Ukraine and a humiliating withdrawal from Kherson this week. Speaking to the Moscow correspondent, Russian civilians' response to the return order was mixed, with one Moscow saying that Russia would still win the war, while another said he hoped the setback would lead both Ukraine and Russia to get rid of this dictator. The Moscow correspondent said the withdrawal was a blow to Moscow, as the Kremlin insisted that the occupied Kherson would forever remain Russian. Russia's withdrawal from Kherson poses a danger to Vladimir Putin. It risks changing how it is perceived at home here, not by the Russian public, but by the Russian elite. For years, Putin has been seen as great strategist and winner by the people around him and the Kremlin elite. But the course of his war changed everything. Fewer people now trust Putin. People living in Moscow are confused about the war. Different opinions and suggestions about the ongoing occupation in Ukraine draw attention. When Moscow said, "Of course, we will win the war. When did the Russians lose? I hope the Russian soldiers come back and Vladimir Putin leaves his post and Ukraine and Russia get rid of this dictator," one woman said. For now, the Russian people are watching and waiting to see where the Kremlin's war goes from here, said. The Kremlin has been in a great chaos for the last few months, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has begun to yield unsuccessful results and disintegration within the army has begun. There are various reports that the Kremlin has entered a civil war. Reactions to Putin did not come only from the Kremlin and the Russian people. Soldiers fighting on behalf of Russia in Ukraine criticized Russian leader Putin after heavy defeats in Ukraine. The head of the Wagner Group, a mercenary combat team assisting Russian forces in Ukraine, publicly criticized the war effort and those responsible during a meeting with Putin. Putin's oligarch and deputy Yevgeny Prigozhin told the Russian autocrat in October that Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had mishandled the invasion. The Russian Wagner Group leader pointed to the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu for his unsuccessful result in Ukraine and said that Sergei Shoigu is also fully responsible. Other reports obtained in Russia placed the responsibility for the failure against the Ukrainian army on the commander of the Russian army, Sergei Surovikin. The commander-in-chief of the Russian army, General Sergei Surovikin, was appointed by Putin to lead the war effort by the Russian leader, hours after the explosion of the Crimean Bridge, the early hours of October 8. Earlier this week, U.S. Undersecretary for Policy Colin H. Kahl told a group of security journalists that the withdrawal from Kherson was a major strategic failure, and that Putin's attempt to overcome the failures in Ukraine failed. Mr. Kahl said, "But I can confidently say that Russia has suffered a major strategic failure in Ukraine. This will not change. Putin has failed and that will not change. A sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine will be permanent," said. Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, said last month he believed it was only a matter of time before Putin was replaced, but warned that the overthrow of Russian leader could spell trouble for Ukraine and the West. Sir Alex Younger, former head of MI6, said Russian leader Putin is in danger of being surrounded by the political constituency he has created. The chauvinist, nationalist, undisputed fascist right-wing with its base of support now criticize Putin for not going far and not being taught. Yes, so we have to be very carefully what we wish for here. Personally, I think that will happen when the time comes. It will replace it, but it will be replaced by critics from the right, he said. While chaos and confusion prevail in the Kremlin in Russia, hectic hours continue to be experienced in Kherson in the south of Ukraine. Kiev announced the liberation of more than a dozen towns around the city of Kherson and reclaiming about 60 square miles. Ukrainian troops successfully recaptured the southern port city of Kherson. The advance came within a day when the Moscow defense minister ordered his troops to withdraw from the regional capital as the battle had reached within 10 miles of the city limits. Hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers flocked to the regional capital this morning. Panicked, the Russian soldiers abandoned their wounded comrades as they hastily retreated. Mikhailo Podolyak, one of the top aides to the Ukrainian president, said Russian forces took out everything they could in Kherson and blew up bridges to slow Ukraine's advance. Mikhailo Podolyak said Russia wants to turn Kherson into a city of death. The Russian army mines everything they can, apartments and sewers. Russian artillery units on the left bank plan to devastate the city. The redeployment of Russian units to the left bank of the Dnipro River is completed. During the redeployment, not a single piece of military hardware or weapon was left behind. All Russian service personnel crossed. The group of Russian forces said there was no loss of men, equipment or supplies. Despite the Ukrainian officials claim that the Russian army left nothing in Kherson during the retreat from Kherson, the Ukrainian soldiers found chests of Russian army military ammunitions when they entered Kherson. It seems that the events in the south of Ukraine and the withdrawal of the Russian military will do great harm to Russian leader Putin. Nobody knows about Putin's new target and strategy in Ukraine. It is not possible to say the same for the Ukrainian army. It is obvious that the next target of the Ukrainian army after Kherson will be Crimea. The Ukrainian army will not stop until it clears the southern line occupied by the Russian army. Thank you for watching us.